Hey, this is Pastor Matt from Calvary. We are continuing in our series on the Gospel of John. So thanks for reading along. We're in John chapter 18 today. And let me just give a kind of a recap here. Chapters 14, 15, 16, 17 are all Jesus talking. And we talked about the fact that this is kind of his long farewell to his disciples, the last night that they are all together before his crucifixion. And those chapters have a lot of Jesus just teaching. And it culminates with chapter 17, that long prayer that Jesus has. And we looked at that in the last video. So we open up with chapter 18, and they're leaving that scene. Now, it's good to think back to chapter 13. Before that long farewell began, that's the last time that Judas was with the group. And so Judas is essentially excused from the meal, from that Passover meal together. And now we're going to see Judas show up as Jesus takes his disciples uh, to go and pray out to the garden. And Judas shows up, and we're told that Judas knows the place because Jesus has taken his disciples there in the past. And so that's kind of the connection. Just some interesting things going on though in John's account, because now we're getting into some very common ground as far as John and the other gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We've noticed to this point that John has a lot of stories and a lot of scenes that are very exclusive to his gospel, and he's sort of it's almost like he's filling in gaps and intentionally telling stories that we haven't heard before. Now that we're in these last moments, there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of things we see other places. But John still has his particular angle, if you will. One of those things that comes out, verse 6, when these soldiers approach Jesus and he gives the answer, I am he, it says, they drew back and fell to the ground. Pretty amazing. Like if you think about it, Jesus says, yeah, I'm the guy you're looking for. They draw back, they fall to the ground, and then they almost have to kind of restart the whole thing all over again. There's also the scene where the servant of the high priest has his ear cut off, and that shows up in the other gospel accounts, but his name does not. So Malchus is the name that John tells us. And we get some insight into why John might have known that as well, because as the story unfolds, now Jesus gets arrested, the disciples scatter, but it's here, Simon Peter followed Jesus. I'm in verse 15, and so did another disciple. Well, the unnamed disciple here is John. That's pretty commonly held by scholars, and I would go with that as well, that this other disciple is John. And John knows the high priest's family and servants and such. It says he was known to the high priest, and that's how he gets Peter into the courtyard. Peter can't get on his own, but he has somebody vouch for him, and that somebody is John. John knows people in this area. He was known to the high priest. That's why he knows the name. He knows Malchus as well. And so we kind of get that little insight. And now the story is almost like two things happening at once, and the camera angles or the camera focus goes back and forth between these two different scenes that are playing out at the same time. We have Peter in the courtyard being questioned and being asked, "Hey, wait a second. You know, you were with this Jesus, weren't you?" And of course, Peter denying three different times. But in between that, we also have the camera shot goes to a different room in a different place, and Jesus is on trial. We're told he's taken to the high priest's house, and it's interesting. There are two high priests that are mentioned, Annas and Caiaphas. Annas, if I'm remembering correctly, is not mentioned in the other gospels. There's a more generic. He was taken to the high priest, or Caiaphas gets mentioned. Annas is actually the former high priest, if you want to get really technical about it. He was removed, though, by Rome, and his son in law, Caiaphas, is the current high priest. So Annas still carries the title, and if you think about it, their family and culturally, there is a deference, if you will, to your elders, and so it does fit that Annas still carries the title of high priest, and he would be written about and talked about as the high priest, even though his time as high priest has technically passed. He still carries a lot of weight. And so Jesus is brought before Annas, and it's almost like the pre-trial, if you will, because then he's brought before Caiaphas. There's no real mention in John's gospel of a council, but that is more than likely the section in front of Caiaphas, kind of that second part. If you look at verse 19 and following, that's probably where that's taking place. So we have this back and forth between Peter and the trial that Jesus is in, back and forth in this tension building, and both sides are losing, if you will. Like Peter keeps denying. and that's a loss. Jesus is essentially allowing himself to be pushed around by these other Jewish leaders, and that's a loss too. And so it gets darker and darker as the story plays out. And finally, Jesus is brought before Pilate. And we get another one of these one-on-one scenes. We've pointed them out before in John's gospel. He's got more of this one-on-one dialogue. And every time Jesus is one-on-one, it seems like there's this mystery that the other person can't quite comprehend. Jesus speaking of spiritual things and Nicodemus not quite getting it and asking the question in chapter 3, does a man have to go back inside his mom to be born again? How does that work, Jesus? The woman at the well asking for this water that's not going to run out because she just doesn't want to fill her bucket again. But Jesus is talking about spiritual matters. And so even Pilate asking about, well, you're a king of the Jews? And Jesus indeed is king of the Jews, but not in a way that Pilate would understand. And we finally culminates kind of with that question, right? Jesus saying that he's come to bear witness to the truth. And Pilate says, what is truth? What is truth? And I'm going to help answer that question for you and for me by going back again to the prologue, to the first chapter of John's gospel. What is truth? And what have we been told already? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. We talked about glory, didn't we? We talked about the fact that glory in John's gospel points to serving to the point of sacrifice. And now in the prologue, he tells us about this Word that became flesh, that came to dwell among us. And we have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. What is truth? Truth was standing in front of Pontius Pilate. What is truth? Truth is the only Son of the Father. Truth is the glory that we see suspended on the cross between two criminals, sacrificing and giving of himself, and rising again so that we might live in truth as well. Truth is Jesus Christ. That's what we see going on in John chapter 18. I hope you're enjoying reading along. Chapter 19 is the dark point in John's gospel. So we're going to read that tomorrow. I look forward to being with you then. Until then, I want to invite you to do this. I want you to share online or share with me by email, by text, however you want. I want you to share, where is it that you hear the voice of truth? Jesus says he is the truth, and those who know truth will hear his voice, will listen to his voice. So where do you listen for that voice of truth? Where does it come through in your life? Is it through a person? Is it through reading? Is it through a time that you set aside each day? Where do you hear that voice of truth? Where does it ring through for you? Where do you get to see and hear truth? I'd love to hear from you and what you think about that, and just how it is that Jesus shows up and speaks truth in your life. Until tomorrow, I'm Pastor Matt. I'm glad that we get to encourage one another as we follow Jesus, the truth, together. I'll see you tomorrow.